This chapter is about substantive topics related to the major racialized groups in our country, and which will lead us to more detailed discussions in the remaining chapters. There are about 38.3 million African Americans in the United States who choose only one race. About 2.2 million African Americans choose two or more races. A total of about 13.4% of the U.S. population is African American. The majority of African Americans live in the South, and now we see a return movement to the South, particularly in areas like Atlanta. What they realized is that the North was not a racial paradise, that they still experienced prejudice and discrimination. In addition, the return to the South may be due to the South being more familiar. And we also have seen in more recent times a growth of jobs in the South. The African American population tends to be more urbanized than most populations. 89.7%, at least in the year 2000, live in cities, and only a third of African Americans live in suburbs. This population also tends to be comparatively young. 3.1.4% of African Americans are under the age of 18. The Hispanic Latina population is the largest minority group in the United States. However, they're considered an ethnic group rather than a racialized group. There are four distinct groups: Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, and Central and South Americans. About 44.3 million Americans are of this population. The majority of Hispanic Americans are Mexican Americans or Chicanos. This population is one of the fastest growing populations, and may be due to high birth rate and high immigration rate. Again, Mexico being our neighbors. This population tends to be highly urbanized. It's about 93% of all this population in total live in cities, compared to about 44% that live in suburbs. In addition, this population is young. About a third of the population is less than 18 years old. So about these different groups specifically, Chicanos are concentrated in 7 states. Again, these are groups with Mexican American descent. They live in California, Texas, New York, Florida, Illinois, Arizona, New Jersey, and New Mexico. Puerto Ricans live in the urban Northeast, in particular New York City and New Jersey. Cuban Americans, there are 2 types. One is refugees from the Castro government, and they are concentrated in Florida. 2.6 million Americans choose Native American only in terms of the race. 1.6 million Americans choose Native American in addition to 2 or more other races. 1.5% of the total American population has some Native American ancestry. And we see some real growth happening in this population. We see a trend of those with mixed parentage to classify themselves as Native American rather than just white. 48% of Native American populations live in the West, and they're concentrated in 3 states: Oklahoma, California, and Arizona. Native American populations are less urbanized than that of the general population. 60% live in urban areas, others live on reservations, and others live in cities near reservations. The Native American population is a young population. 40% are under the age of 18. Next, we'll talk about groups with intermediate status, or the middleman position, and these groups are Asians, Asian Americans, Jewish Americans, and white ethnic Americans. Near, or even in some cases above, the overall societal norm in some cases include these different groups. They tend to have higher incomes and have higher positions in education. They, however, are the middleman because they're subjected to widespread discrimination even today. they're excluded from being part of the power elite. In terms of Asian Americans specifically, the 6 largest Asian American groups in this country are Chinese, Filipinos, Asian Indians, Vietnamese, Koreans, and Japanese. About 10.6 million people in America choose Asian American as their only race. About 12 million people choose Asian American along with two more races. About 10% of the American population is Asian American. Asian Americans are mostly concentrated in the West. About 48.3% live in the West, in particular states of California and Hawaii. They are highly urban. 97% of all Asian Americans live in cities. And interesting enough, they live also in ethnic enclaves like Chinatowns. And they are in central cities. Some Chinatowns are located in San Francisco, Oakland areas, New York City, Honolulu, and Los Angeles, Long Beach areas. 51% live in suburbs. This population is older than other populations. 24% of Asian Americans are older than the age of 18. Jewish Americans, the research is difficult to obtain because the census does not track people's religious identification. However, when we try to estimate the population size of Jewish Americans, is a big range. Some say it's about 3.1 million, some say it could be up to 6.2 million. However, overall, in terms of the Jewish population, it makes up about 1.7% of the total U.S. population. The U.S. population of Jews makes about 40% of the world's population of Jewish identified people. This population is also growing less rapidly than the general population, and this is due to a low birth rate and intermarriage with other types of religions. This group is also highly urbanized. 10 out of 20 Jewish Americans live in urban areas, and particularly they're located in New York metropolitan areas. 64% of Jewish Americans live in the Northeast. Eastern and Southern white European ethnic groups refers to a wide variety of groups from Eastern and Southern Europe. Such groups are Italians, the Polish, Greeks, Russians, Hungarians, Czechoslovakians, and Ukrainian Americans. These types of groups are more recently immigrated to the groups compared to the Northern and Western groups. They came after 1900. These white ethnic groups are concentrated in the Northeast and in industrial cities and Great Lakes states. They are highly urban and belong to religions outside of Protestant majority in the U.S. These Eastern and Southern European white ethnic groups are Catholic, Jewish, and some belong to Orthodox churches. Next, we'll talk about Arab Americans. It's about 1.2 million Americans, and less than 1% at 0.5% of the population. And this can also be due to underreporting as well. Again, maybe they're not being reported as much because of recent upsurge of discrimination. There's a wide diversity of those who are considered Arab, and these nationalities are Lebanese, Syrian, Egyptian, Palestinian, Jordanian, Moroccan, Iraqi, and other Arab groups. They tend to have an above average education and occupational prestige. However, again, they experience high levels of discrimination. So we see here a combination of privilege and oppression. We have to think about Arab Americans and also the religion, how those intersect. There's a great diversity of religion among Arab Americans. The majority are Christians. They're either Catholic or Orthodox religion of some type. The first wave of immigration of Christian Arab Americans came between 1875 and 1920. A minority of Arab Americans are Muslim, and they immigrated after World War II. Many Muslims are not Arab. So again, being Arab American and Muslim are not the same. Again, those who are Muslim but not Arab can include Persians or Iranians, African Americans, and some of those with European ancestry. Now we'll talk about whites from Western and Northern European areas, and these are the privileged or dominant group. They have more advantages than the other groups that we discussed before, and they make up about 1/2 of the American population. They immigrated earlier than Southern and Eastern Europeans, and overall they're the most assimilated. Other groups have to assimilate to this group. They are the standard. And Western and Northern Europeans as a dominant group are less conscious about their ethnicity. It's not relevant to their identity. This group is also called and described as WASP, White Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and they again are predominantly Protestant. They are widely distributed geographically, so in every state and large percentages. They tend to have a dominant socioeconomic status. Overall, again, this group is considered what is white. So consciously or unconsciously, many white Americans today identify with whites regardless of ethnicity. When thinking about racial issues, ethnic differences do not matter. So instead of thinking of themselves as German or Italian, they see themselves more as just simply white. And this idea of whiteness is developed during the times of increased occupational competition. And another characteristic of whiteness is this colorblind mentality. It's the denial of racial differences and denies the reality of racial inequality. Those with a colorblind mentality are able to create a rationalization that the system is fair and reform is not needed. They do not have the personal experience of being excluded and discriminated against, so they do not know what it is to be oppressed racially. So they think because it doesn't happen to them, it's not real. They assume the experience of minority groups are this. There's a substantially higher proportion of the Black and Latino populations. We have seen evidence of improvement in minority status. There is a substantially higher proportion of the Black and Latino populations in high status positions in the United States than ever before. However, the stat still lags behind the percentage for whites. The gap in individual incomes between employed African Americans and whites has decreased substantially since about 1950. We see different degrees of this increased access to upper incomes between men and women. Men make about 75%, or black men make about 75% of what white male incomes in 2006, whereas black women make 67% of white male income in 2016. There's different degrees of income comparatively between white men and black men, and conversely white women and white men. Black men make about 75% of white male income in 2006, and black women make about 67% of white male income in 2006. Education, however, narrows the income gap. We still, however, see that there's a long ways to go. Black men make about 80% of white men. Latino men make about 75% of white men. Black women make slightly more than white women. And Latino women make about 90% of white women. Minority gains, we also see minority gains in political representation. We see an increase between 1970 and 2007. The number of black elected officials increased from fewer than 1,500 to more than 9,500. Between 1884 and 2007, the number of Latina elected officials increased from fewer than 3,100 to 5,129. We have also seen changes in terms of legal discrimination. We see the elimination of legalized forms of discrimination or du jour. However, de facto, or still this day, discrimination still exists. Deliberate forms of racial discrimination are less common and less open. However, it does not mean that it does not exist. We still see economic inequality, and we'll talk specifically about African Americans. The median family income for blacks is 58% of the white median family income. We see increases in female-headed households. We see that 44% of all black families are described as female-headed households. However, this is a partial answer to the income inequality. Even two-parent households with both parents working, we see that inequality still exists. Black families make about 81% of white family income. The unemployment rate is 2 times that of whites, and this may be due to reduction of low-skill, low-paying jobs, in addition to African Americans being excluded from learning the skills necessary for better jobs. The poverty rate amongst black Americans is 2 1/3 to 3 times higher than white families. And a fuller answer to this could be lack of access to quality education and full-time employment. So education and employment are tied, and both are under-resourced. We still see tremendous inequality. Now we'll talk about Latino and Latina Americans. The median family income for Latino families is 61% of white median family incomes. 24% of families are female-headed households. And however, the income gap exists even when considering married couple families. The unemployment rate is 1.5 times that of whites, and the poverty rate is 2.5 to 3 times that of white families. So overall, an overall picture of inequality, economic inequality, says that things are not getting better. There's improvements only during times of economic boom across the country. Increasing stratification and a growing gap between the well-off and destitute is happening even within various communities. Economic positions have improved only marginally and remain substantially lower than that of the average position of whites. In terms of political representation, there's a below share of the population. 25% of total population should be represented in our political positions. 1.8% of all elected officials are African American, and 1% of all elected officials are Latino or Latino. In terms of education, those 25 to 29 are sampled, and we look at high school graduation rates first. The black dropout rates are comparable to whites, 13% for both in 2007. Those are those who attain diplomas through GED equivalency are also included. Latino dropout rates are 2.5 times that of whites, 35% in 2007. In terms of college attendance and graduation, 19% of African Americans are college graduates, 11% of Latino and Latina Americans are college graduates, and both groups are less likely to attend college than whites. They are underrepresented compared to the general group population. Both Latino and African Americans are more likely to attend 2-year than 4-year colleges. We also see that African Americans, Latino and Latina Americans are underrepresented in graduate and professional schools. A little less than 10% of African Americans are in graduate school, and 8.2% of Latinos are also in graduate school. These numbers are lower for both groups in professional schools, so law school and medical school. So when we intersect race, gender, and class, we see that the industrial era brought about the role of the housewife. For low-income women and women of color, this was not an option. They had to work. There are different needs for poor women and women of color. We see that these women experience sexual harassment and abuse, racial and gender discrimination in hiring and pay, and the general low pay of powerlessness of women in service jobs and other working class occupations. Now when we look at full-time versus part-time, we see that white women are more likely to work part-time. African American women are more likely to work full-time, and Latino women are not likely to work outside of the home. We see this may be due to the lack of better paying industrial jobs versus increase in lower paying service jobs. There's less unemployment among women of color compared to men of color. Women of color do the service jobs, whereas men of color traditionally did the industrial jobs, and those have been outsourced. We see that people of color are underrepresented in most desirable jobs, those professional managerial jobs, and overrepresented in service, production, and transportation occupations. Many women of color work in low-wage service occupations, and this is likely the sole source of support in the family, so again, overworked and underpaid.